Now, termination for convenience is a very different animal from termination for cause, and that's what we're going to talk about now. We touched on termination for convenience in an earlier video, but again, we need to look a little more closely at exactly what happens in the context of a termination for convenience. Now, the first thing to note is that it's only on the owner's side that there's a right to terminate for convenience. There's no right by the contractor to terminate for convenience. And the underlying concept is simply that the owner can, for whatever reason, decide, you know what, I don't want to have this project anymore. It may have run out of financing. It may have determined that its resources are better spent elsewhere. There can be any number of reasons. This started in the government contracts world, federal government contracts, where the United States government inserted a termination for convenience provision, and it's sort of taken hold in the private sector as well. But the basic idea is that the owner doesn't have to wait for a contractor to be in breach. There doesn't have to be any breach. The contractor can be performing perfectly, and the owner just decides, for whatever reason, the owner doesn't want to continue with the contract. And so that's the essential concept in 14.4.1. Now, if the owner chooses to terminate for convenience, there are some fairly specific ramifications that come from that, and those are spelled out in 14.4.2. The contractor has to stop work, has to take steps to preserve the work, protect it, put coverings over, whatever's needed to keep the work from degrading under the elements, if that's relevant in a given project, and to terminate the contract, the subcontracts and purchase orders, etc. So there's some sort of winding up that has to be done, that the contractor has to be in charge of, but it's designed to essentially bring everything to a halt in an orderly fashion. Now, the downside to an owner terminating for convenience is in 14.4.3, the owner is still liable for not simply the cost for the work that the contractor's already done, that should be fairly obvious, but also any costs incurred by reason of the termination. For example, there may be a price tag associated with the contractor terminating the subcontracts, things like that. And in that event, the owner may be on the hook for some fairly substantial termination-related costs. So termination for convenience is an important right that the owner has, but it's something that comes with a price tag. And one of the things that you will sometimes see in contracts is a conversion clause that says, essentially, if the owner terminates the contractor for cause, that is, the owner thinks the contractor's in breach, and therefore terminates the contractor for cause, but it turns out that an arbitrator or a judge or jury later on determines that the owner's for cause termination was wrongful, that the termination will automatically be deemed to have been a termination for convenience. And what that does is essentially cap the owner's liability, so that if the owner has purported to terminate the contractor for cause, so that the owner can presumably recover damages for the contractor's alleged breach, but it turns out the owner was wrong, because it's often the case that it's not 100% clear who's in breach at any given point. If it turns out the owner was wrong, this conversion provision in the contract will essentially protect the owner by saying, okay, my bad, I terminated for cause when I didn't really have cause, but we're going to call it a termination for convenience. Now, as we just saw, that comes with its own price tag, because the owner still is on the hook for the termination related costs. But what the owner would not be on the hook for would be all of the lost profits and so forth, other kinds of consequential type damages that the contractor might otherwise be entitled to if the contractor were to prove wrongful termination for cause.